According to 17th century apologist Blaise Pascal, God, if he exists, is incomprehensible. He cannot be understood. That means that you cannot apply reason to God. He's beyond reason. And if God cannot be understood, it's also impossible to prove that he exists, because what could you say about him if he's beyond reason? That's why Pascal says that reason cannot help us figure out the question of God's existence. He is about as explicit as any Christian theologian and apologist about this, providing an admission that is rare. For even those who recognize that the existence of God is beyond all possible proof and verification are still hesitant to advertise this fact to the world. After all, no one wants to believe in things without reasons. Pascal goes so far as to praise Christians, himself included, for their consistency in refusing to offer proofs for the improvable. Well, I suppose congratulations are in order. But Pascal doesn't just leave the matter there. We might be tempted to wonder, why is he, after all this bluster, still a bit insecure about this situation? Pascal was, we should remember, a scientist and a philosopher who understood the importance of backing claims with reasons, at least when it came to the physical world. And so Pascal asks if there is another approach we can take to this situation. And this is where the wager, Pascal's wager, comes in. Even though reason can't tell us one way or the other if God exists, says Pascal, we can still think through the consequences of believing in God or not believing in God. And so the wager goes like this. You can make a bet or a wager that God exists or that he doesn't exist. You have to choose one or the other, for there are only two options. And as Geddy Lee says, if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. The thing you are risking in this bet is your life. So let's game this out. What are the risks and what are the rewards? If you bet on God's existence, which is to say, if you act as though God exists, and he does, the rewards will be completely out of proportion to the risk, for the reward is eternal life, which is infinite. And if you bet on God and lose the bet, meaning he doesn't exist, you don't really lose anything at all, except that you lived your life as though God exists. It would be like betting $1 with a 50-50 chance of winning $1 trillion. Why would you not make this bet? And what's your exposure if you lose? $1. Clearly, the returns are very good here. Anytime there's a chance of turning something finite into something infinite, it's worth a try. On the other hand, you can bet that God doesn't exist. What do you get if you're right? Well, nothing, because you just lived your one life and then you died. And what do you get if you're wrong and God does exist? Well, this one's really bad. You get infinite loss, not just because you missed out on eternal life, but also because you ended up in hell forever. This would be like betting $1 on a 50-50 chance of getting $1 back. But if you lose, you owe $1 trillion. Well, that's an idiotic bet. So, to be clear, you have 4 possible scenarios and 4 possible outcomes. Number 1, you bet on God, but he doesn't exist. In this case, you don't get anything, but you don't lose anything either. Number 2, you bet on God and he does exist. Well, this is the best possible outcome. You hit the cosmic jackpot. Number 3, you bet against God and he doesn't exist. Well, good for you. You had one life to live and that's all. You weren't going to get anything more. Number 4, you bet against God and he does exist. Well, this is not a good situation. You are now in the deepest of all shit. Well, of course, only a fool would wager against God. Discussion over. The most basic issue for me is that the wager can capitalize on fear, on a kind of existential FOMO. Pascal is not wrong. If there is a credible combination of rewards and threats on the scale described in the wager, it does seem incautious and foolish to be dismissive. Maybe we should all take a bet on God. But the operative word here is credible. Since I already came to the conclusion that Christianity is not credible, the wager means nothing to me. My response to the wager is the same as my response to the threat of hell. Making it sound more horrible and frightening doesn't make it more believable. Similarly, just because a crazy person yells at me and waves a gun in my face, it doesn't mean he's right. I'm not going to let fear cloud my reasoning. Before taking on this question as an atheist and explaining why I foolishly refuse to bet on God, I want to take a moment to appreciate Blaise Pascal. I'm pretty sure he was a bona fide genius. He made notable contributions to several fields of study, starting at age 16, when he published a valid geometrical theorem that still bears his name today. I don't know about you, but my big accomplishment at age 16 was learning the blues scale on the guitar. Pascal left his mark on mathematics, physics, probability theory, philosophy, and theology. He was the first person in the world to make a computer. It was a mechanical device that performed additions called the Pascaline. He made about 20 of them, and there are still a few in existence. I imagine this is why there is a programming language named after him. And if that was not enough, he also invented public transportation. Pascal was plagued by bad health his entire adult life, and he died at the early age of 39. The exact cause of his death is unclear, but an autopsy revealed several damaged organs and a brain lesion or a deformity. The details are unclear, which could explain his frequent and intense headaches. He had always been a Christian, but after a memorable religious experience in 1654, he became more devout and he began engaging in religious polemics. It was during this period that he came up with the famous wager. In spite of his genius and his accomplishments, Pascal presents a bit of a puzzle, at least to me. On the one hand, he was a man of science and mathematics, disciplines which are founded on reason. But when it came to religion and the question of God, he rejected reason, except that he used it to deconstruct reason itself. I keep thinking about that incident in 1658, when he was working on an essay on a problem in geometry, but he came down with a toothache and he had to stop. After a few days, the toothache disappeared on its own, and Pascal interpreted this as a sign from God that he should continue with the essay. He did, and he went on to publish it as well. This seems to show how Pascal's intensely rational mind somehow coexisted with an irrationally religious one. Does God really speak through toothaches? If so, what a strange and mute kind of messaging system. Surely this is sheer superstition. I have trouble understanding how someone could turn their rational brain off like this and then turn it on again to work on geometry. And yet the superstition egged him on to write the rational, disciplined, and brilliant essay in geometry. The year of grace, 1654. Monday, 23rd November. From about 10:30 in the evening until midnight. Fire. God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, not the God of philosophers and scholars. Certainty, certainty, heartfelt joy, peace. God of Jesus Christ, God of Jesus Christ. These are the words Pascal wrote down after an overwhelming and maybe even life-changing religious experience. He goes on to describe his response to this event in a series of phrases and short sentences. And as you read them, you can almost see him writing feverishly to capture the moment on paper before it fades. This is borne out by the actual manuscript, which still exists, and shows a very sloppy and hurried hand. This piece of writing has been called Pascal's memorial, and it was so important to him that he had it sewn to the inside of his coat, and it was only found after his death. As far as we know, he had never told anyone else about it. Here are some of the phrases he wrote down. The world forgotten, everything except God. He can only be found by the ways that have been taught in the Gospels. Joy, 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 tears of joy. Total submission to Jesus Christ. And notice this last one, which hints at the wager. Everlasting joy in return for one day's striving upon earth. It seems that these 2 hours of fire were so intense that they became Pascal's guiding light. Everything else paled in comparison. He had found a direct line to God, one that did not need the intellect. And I can hardly blame Pascal for this turn. He was a tortured genius, probably lonely, never married, and plagued by intense and debilitating illnesses. Suddenly, he has an amazing experience that seems to put everything in place. The supernatural has invaded him, and perhaps even made sense of his sufferings. Who in this situation would not reach out to the lifeline of this experience and hold on to it with a death grip? But just because we can view this situation with compassion and understanding, it does not make it normative, nor does it validate Pascal's extrapolation that God is beyond reason, or even that God was involved. Pascal's experience is not ours. This is why reason is so valuable. It takes the question of truth outside of the realm of one person's experience, and it puts it in the realm of our shared experience. Additionally, there's a fairly obvious possible explanation for Pascal's fire. We have already seen that he suffered frequent headaches, that he was in poor health, and that he had a brain lesion. From his own description, Pascal simply had an intense experience, which he then interpreted in the religious categories that he had already accepted. Was this really God, or was it Pascal's brain? The irony is that belief in the supernatural can be sourced in a physical condition. The first problem with Pascal's wager is the very first claim, that reason cannot tell us one way or another if God exists. Of course, not everyone agrees about this. In fact, some of us think that Pascal has scored an epic own goal. God is incomprehensible, he says. We cannot know anything about him, he says. And we can't even prove he exists. Okay, fair enough. Then why does anything more need to be said about this? Thank you. My work here is done. It seems fair to say that anything which is non-rational and can't be shown to exist is also not a thing. At least it's not worth paying any attention to. We certainly carry around with us the idea that things which don't make sense and can't be shown to exist don't. So why are we contemplating this God concept in the first place? Why has it been brought forward? Why does it deserve our attention if it is so completely at odds with everything that we know about the world and how rationality works? It's a bit like the invisible dragon that Carl Sagan spoke of. Your neighbor says that he has one in his garage. So you go there to see if maybe you can verify its existence non-visually. But after attempting this for several minutes, your neighbor explains that this invisible dragon is also an imperceptible dragon. When you express skepticism, your neighbor says, well, reason can't tell you one way or the other if it's there. He can put it that way if he wants to, but he's really saying that there's no dragon. And I suppose that anyone, Christians included, would laugh in response to this neighbor's ridiculous claim about his invisible dragon. But why is the same thing taken seriously when you just swap out the nouns and use God instead of dragon? Now we have to treat baseless nonsense seriously. Well, we don't. God is by now a personality that is attached to Western civilization, an imaginary friend to the whole culture. Because of this, people feel free to skip the burden of proof and simply affirm that he's hard to disprove. Let's be clear. God was never detected in the first place. He was first imagined by the ancients, like all the other gods that no one believes in anymore. And more recently, he was just assumed to exist. The only evidence that most people have for the existence of God is that other people think he exists. That's it. So if reason can't prove God's existence, this just means that there's literally no reason to think he exists. And I don't know about you, but I'm not about to be bullied by the high stakes of Pascal's wager to contemplate the possibility of an invisible and imperceptible being. You see, the high stakes have been manufactured precisely for this, to hijack reason and understanding. I don't know if I'll include this in the video, but you could use Pascal's wager to argue for betting on spammers. You know, like the Nigerian prince who has millions of dollars in the bank, but he can't access it. This guy's willing to share it with you, and all you need to do is help him withdraw the funds. According to Pascal, we should definitely bet on this Nigerian prince. Why? Well, because the rewards are incredible compared to the stake. But I suppose defenders of the wagers would say, no. That's different, because the Nigerian prince con is a well-known scam. The wager doesn't apply where there's obvious falsehood in the premise. But then I would say, yeah, that's my point exactly. Maybe I should include that. So here's an interesting situation. Pascal tells us that we can know nothing about God because God is by definition beyond understanding. But then he assumes a very specific thing about God to be true. That God is the sort of being who deals out rewards and punishments in the afterlife. Wait, I thought we couldn't know anything about him. So how do we know this thing? Well, the answer, of course, is that it's in the Bible. The Bible tells us that there is a being called God, which will punish or reward us forever, depending on our actions and our beliefs. Now, Pascal was a traditional Christian who believed all the usual Christian things. The book I'm holding is the collected religious works of Pascal. It's called The Mind on Fire, and I can confirm that Pascal believed in God, in Jesus, the Bible, miracles, sin, salvation, heaven and hell, and many other doctrines taught by the Catholic Church. But he didn't believe these things because of reason. He believed them because of faith. He's explicit about it. So with the wager, Pascal is telling us to bet on a body of knowledge for which there is no evidence. But why? Just because someone said it? You see, once you remove reason from the playing field, there isn't much else to go on. Are we really supposed to take any extravagant claim about the supernatural seriously and bet for it or against it just because it has been stated? Or just because someone has said it is so? Or just because it's frightening? Well, if that's the way it works, I can come up with an even more extreme scenario, and you will have to bet on it instead. Behold, the ancient prophet Elishua has declared that those who disobey the god Zenith shall be duplicated 1,000-fold, and all copies shall together be eternally squashed in an endless black hole. Said individuals shall also be imbued with claustrophobia before entering the eternal squashing. Well, I don't know. That sounds worse than the Christian hell to me, but I could be wrong. On the positive side, Pascal's wager could make a good argument for becoming a Mormon. After all, faithful Mormons become gods themselves. That beats heaven by a long shot. I'm sorry, but this can never work. Surely, we cannot be beholden to whatever bizarre version of reality any wacky individual comes up with. On second thought, maybe that's exactly how the human race rolls. But let's move on. Assuming this, for the sake of the argument, that God does exist, he might have any number of plans for the afterlife, including nothing at all. And these plans impact the argument of the wager. For example, some Christians teach that there's a heaven and everyone goes there because God forgives everyone. The wager suddenly seems less compelling in that scenario. It doesn't really matter how you live your life relative to God's existence. And how can we even know that betting on God means betting on the Christian view of God? What about gods that are similar to the Christian God, Allah and Yahweh? Can we bet on those guys too? Or do we just pick the scariest one? If God is Atman, as understood by Hinduism, then God is everything, and the wager once again loses its luster. Or what about the God of deism? That God set the world in motion, but he has no interest in human affairs. No wager needed. In Star Wars, the Force gives you attunement with the universe, but the afterlife was invented by the Jedi. Oh wait, That one's just science fiction, and we're not supposed to believe that. But why not? Well, anyway, I keep getting all these mythologies mixed up. Pascal walks us down the garden path to the God of the Bible as interpreted by his own sect. If we aren't careful, we will fail to notice all the forks in the path which lead down many other options where the wager isn't even relevant. These aren't the paths you want, says Pascal. Pascal's wager is starting to feel like a carefully built house of cards where he just shows us the top card and we don't notice all the other ones that are holding it up. Okay. Atheists and skeptics often misunderstand the wager to mean that Pascal is urging people to choose to believe something based on the calculation of the wager. Of course, we all know that you can't just choose what you believe. But rest assured, this is not what Pascal is doing. Rather, betting on God for Pascal is a call to behave like a Christian, to go to church, to embrace the rituals, to join others on the same journey. When you do this, he says, you will tame the passions that lie behind your lack of faith. And you will eventually come to believe through a more holistic process. But isn't this also hugely problematic? Isn't Pascal just counseling us to embark on a journey of confirmation bias? Surely if you are even remotely leaning towards a certain worldview, and then you join others who practice that worldview, you are extremely likely to become a sincere believer and practitioner yourself. We skeptics tend to see this as a problem with religion, not a solution. It is not a path to faith, but a program of indoctrination, pure and simple, that Pascal is recommending. And maybe those two are the same. And notice once again the sleight of hand regarding knowledge of God. We can't know anything about him, but betting on God definitely means joining Christians. This approach also conveniently sets aside the question of truth and proof, which we can now see has been Pascal's agenda all along. He doesn't want to convince you that God exists or that Christianity is true. He doesn't think he can do that. He wants to do an end run around reason and reasons and get you into a pattern of life. In this scheme, the wager has really only threatened you with hell and promised you the rewards of heaven so that you will turn off your brain and go to church. I can't say whether Pascal is being cynically manipulative here. I tend to think that he's not, but maybe just because I kind of like the guy. But surely others have been cynical and manipulative and unethical when they have applied the same methods. Avoid questions of fact and focus on the subjective benefits. That's how you get them hooked. I can almost hear the distant echoes of a multi-level marketing seminar speaker. Some people call it a pyramid scheme, but I don't think it is. Anyway, I'm so glad you came. I just know that you and I are going to get very rich together. I'm again puzzled by how eagerly a rational, scientific mind sets aside reason and reasons when it comes to religion. And to what end? What is the motivation here? If you can't show that something is true, why do you want to pursue it yourself? And why do you want to persuade other people to join that pursuit? Aren't you concerned about the ethics of this? Pascal argues that it's worth living a religious Christian life, even if God doesn't exist, because of the possible infinite reward. Since seeing himself as a Christian, I suppose he feels that being a Christian is a pretty good way to go, whether it's true or not. In fact, there's an alternate explanation for the wager. What if it's a coping mechanism? Is Pascal trying to convince himself that even if God isn't real, it still makes sense to be a Christian? Nobody wants to give up their religion. But anyway, to him, it feels like betting on God means you live a great life. As he says, and I quote, "Now, what harm will come to you by choosing this course of action? You will be faithful, honest, humble, grateful, full of good works, a genuine and true friend. In fact, you will no longer find yourself swamped by poisonous pleasures such as those of lust and desire for fame. I assure you that you will gain in this life, and that with every step you take along this way, you will realize that you have bet on something sure and infinite, which has cost you nothing." But that doesn't sound quite right. Even Christians will tell you that the Christian life is no walk in the park and is very costly. I think it was Jesus who said, "Pick up your cross every day." And Pascal himself, come to think of it, considered the Christian life to be defined by suffering. He regularly put off doctors because he wanted to embrace his religiously inspired mission of suffering. Does that sound like something that costs nothing? It is also true that indoctrination does not work on everyone. Some of us aren't going to just start acting and thinking like Christians when we go to church as part of our bet on God. To the contrary, we will just get more and more irritated every day by all the bullshit and sentimental religiosity that surrounds us. No, that is not an easy life. Another issue is sexuality. Christianity tends to look on LGBTQ identities and behaviors as sinful. If betting on God means abandoning these and living a life of sexual, emotional, and relational frustration, then the wager is surely asking a lot. Furthermore, some people will simply reject the wager out of hand if it means becoming a bigot. They will happily go to hell just to express solidarity with friends and loved ones. What do you do when people have a higher priority than just living forever in heaven? Of course, this does not logically nullify the wager, but it does call into question Pascal's simplistic moral dualism, as if Christianity naturally holds the moral high ground vis-a-vis lustful and prideful heathens. Similar things could be said about other moral problems in the Bible, like genocide, slavery, and vicious retributive violence. It seems like Pascal is massively underestimating the costs here. Far from his rosy picture, living the Christian life can be stilting, stupefying, and life-draining. And if it turns out that this life is all you have, you are betting everything, every living moment, and every thought and feeling you will ever have. Okay, here's a question. Isn't a finite life worth the same as an infinite one, given that they are both the sum of all total experience? This life is very valuable, and we should think very carefully about placing it in the hands of theologians and moral totalitarians. They don't value your life and your experience because they think it's a mere blink in the eye in the grand scheme. These are the sorts of people who are happy to say things like, "It's okay to be gay as long as you don't act on it," or "Don't study science, you'll lose your faith," or "The Bible says you must not divorce your abusive spouse." It's easy enough to say that our temporary sufferings and frustrations will earn an eternal reward. It doesn't affect them. These religious moralists will happily make your life miserable to prop up their own beliefs. but you are the only one who gets to decide how to spend the precious gift of life. Well, let's see. I need to start working on a conclusion. I certainly don't want to leave people with the impression that I'm pressuring them or trying to persuade them that they shouldn't bet on God. I mean, okay, I am, but with due deference to the fact that we all have to make up our own minds. Maybe that's the cool thing about the wager. It asks you to move off the fence, if you're on one. I can't help but imagine how this will land with Christians. Rob, why are you doing this? What is your motivation? Why do you want to destroy people's faith? Well, I suppose for the same reason that Pascal put forward his wager in the first place. It's that urge to seek out truth and tell others about it. Some kind of evolutionary instinct connected to truth as a path to survival. And the wager is such a twisted mess of fear-mongering and confused reasoning wrapped up in sincerity and earnest seeking that I just can't shut up about it. Okay, well, I better get to work on this and finish the video.